The reason I picked the psalm, when I went through and scheduled the psalms that were picked, to look for psalms that would somehow have some kind of connection with the Parsha. And the Parsha that we just heard, you just heard, is just, this is one of the most significant Parshas in Judaism. The results, the impact of the story that we just heard is beyond exaggeration. If Judaism is right, this is what we believe happened. When those spies came back and Israel refused to go into the land, well, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians on the anniversary of that date. And then it was destroyed by the Romans on the same anniversary of the same date. And then the Spanish Inquisition was implemented on the same anniversary of the same date. And England expelled the Jews in 1290 AD on the same anniversary of the same date. World War I started on the same anniversary of the same date. France's King Louis, I forget which number, I think it's the 9th, burned 20,000 scrolls, Jewish scrolls, on the same anniversary of the same date. It just goes on and on and on. That story has tremendous coattails of significance in Judaism. And this psalm really is probably, well, let's read the psalm. And let me just point out to you as we look at it. Last time, I think, was the first time I put the Septuagint on the column, on the right column. I just thought it'd be interesting to do based upon last week's. Not a big difference here between these, the two, the New King James and the Septuagint on the right. The New King James is based on an English manuscript, based on a Greek manuscript that's called the Textus Receptus, and I'll say some things about that. I've talked about it before in here, and I'll bring that up again in a little while. But it is essentially also based upon the Hebrew Masoretic text, and there's a lot of discussion about which manuscript is better, the Masoretic or the Septuagint, and most Messianics are going to go over to the Masoretic text. But the Septuagint can't be ignored because it's quoted so often in the New Testament. So they're both there. So Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept. When we remembered Zion, we hung our harps upon the willows in the midst of it. For there those who carried us away captive asked of us a song, and those who plundered us requested mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. O daughter of Babylon, who are to be destroyed, happy the one who repays you as you have served us. Happy the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. When I look at that psalm, that verse there's a lot of psalms that really go to places of judgment. Psalm 69, 109, psalms where David says, break their teeth, let's send them to Sheol. I mean, but this psalm, probably more than any psalm, I think that verse, the weightiness of that verse right there is just it's in your face, and so the idea of this is a difficult psalm, and it's not one that we'll often hear taught because it is so heavy, but we're going to do it. So I go on over to page 2, and on the bottom, I'm going to give you some thoughts here. First, Sansino. And what is Sonsino? You know, it's non-Messianic, it's Jewish, it's Orthodox. And this is what they say. The feelings which move the writer of this psalm will best be understood if we think of him as an exile, recently back from Babylon, viewing with horror the havoc wrought in the city he dearly loved. Non-Jewish critics, writing in comfort and security, usually deplore the bitter vindictiveness of the imprecation. What's an imprecation? It's a curse. So non-Jewish critics, writing in comfort and security, usually deplore the bitter vindictiveness of the imprecation which ends the psalm. Refugees from the continent, when they return and see how their native city has turned into masses of rubble by the Germans, will share the mood of the psalmist. Now, these are my thoughts now on what Sonsino actually said on page 3. Although Sonsino does believe that the psalm was written after the Jews had returned from exile, and it's really hard to say the psalm does not occur either in Babylon or after they return. He just directly mentions Babylon. Okay, Sonsino's essential point really only requires that the psalm was written after the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed. And Sonsino is trying to help the reader understand the raw emotions of the psalm. With the mention of Babylon in verse 1, there's no doubt the psalm was written either during the exile or soon thereafter. But if you struggle with Sonsino's point, you might ask yourself, how are the expressed feelings at the end of the psalm any different from the feelings being expressed by souls that are actually under the altar in heaven? How is it any different? Revelation 6. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and the testimonies which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? How is that really any different? It's really not that different. This is a challenge. Let me just say, I didn't put it in here, but of interest, Don asked me, who wrote the psalm? Okay, so Art Scroll has some interesting stuff on that. Quoting from the Talmud, points out that there is a Jewish, and this is where I'll just say, ridiculously silly argument. Okay, there's no other way to say it. That there's a ridiculously silly argument in the Talmud that David wrote the psalm prophetically, knowing what would happen, and then Jeremiah took David's psalm and edited it so that it would fit the circumstances exactly that they had experienced with Babylon. That's just the problem sometimes with a lot of stuff in Judaism, especially Art Scroll, is they will, and sometimes Sonsino, but they'll circle the wagons to make everything look really good within Judaism. Yeah, we blew it, so this happened with Numbers 13, but you know, we got some real heroes and they knew all this. That's kind of hard to do here. So when was it written? Robert Alter, non-Messianic Jewish scholar. This psalm was almost certainly composed shortly after the deportation of the Judeans by the Babylonians in 586. The experience of the exile is fresh and painful. In other words, what he's saying is this psalm was written before they came back. It's written while they're still in exile. And then you got Word Biblical Commentary, which is Christian. The early years of return from exile before the rebuilding of either the temple and so 537 to 515 BC or the city walls were evidently the period. In other words, this is right after they came back. I didn't put it in here, but the Jewish Study Bible also says that, right after they came back. So the point there is kind of like they just came back, they've been living in this mess, and they just see the place just tore apart. And anybody here ever see that movie, The Pianist? You know, there's that scene of what, I saw it so long ago, it's hard to remember the whole, but you remember, I think it wasn't that like, was that Poland that was destroyed? And just what that, can you imagine if you lived there and you walked in and saw that? right? And just, what would you feel, right? There's the picture. So the 3 points of the psalm, these are actually the way I did it. There is passionate pain in the first part of the psalm. And then there is this self-imprecation. In other words, this idea of the psalmist is now calling a curse upon himself. If I do this, let this happen to me. So this passionate pain, followed by this self-imprecation, followed by an angry imprecation against the Edomites. That's the psalm here. Okay, so first of all, the passionate pain. This won't be as long of a psalm as we normally do, I don't think. But here we go. Psalm 137, verse 1. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yes, we wept when we remembered Zion. So the rivers, usually a word that's translated as rivers, but far less often could be floods or streams. Robert Alter points out that the word probably refers to canals, because Babylon built canals between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And so these canals went across and they would irrigate the land. And so it could be that that's actually what it's referring to. And actually, Word Biblical Commentary says the same thing. So the word could just literally mean that it's literally they're sitting by one of the canals. And that is exactly what Ezekiel says he does in the opening of Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1. He's sitting by one of the canals, the Kabar Canal in Babylon. So it would really fit that would be a possibility. And it says they sat down. Now, it's customary for mourners to sit on the ground, like when you're sitting Shiva, somebody dies. And so they sat on the ground. And you can see that in Isaiah 47, verse 1. Come down and sit in the dust, O daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne. In Judaism, when you're sitting Shiva, it's like, I remember like how we were raised. You cover the mirrors in your house and you sit low, and that's just sitting Shiva. You're mourning. And you can see the same kind of picture in the book of Job. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard all of this adversity that had come upon him, each one of them came from his own place. Eliphaz the Termite, Bildad the Shuhite, the Get-Lostite, and Zophar the I don't have a good one for that one. For they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. So they sat down with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word. And I've never done that good in mourning with someone in my entire life. Never. To sit on the ground with someone and not say a word for 7 days. I've never sat on a couch for 7 days and not said a word. I opened my mouth. And when I look at that, I just think, and these are the epitome in the Bible of the worst comforters. And they did much better than I have ever done with anybody. Doesn't that give you a sense? Have you ever not said a word to someone for 7 days who is suffering? Verse 2, we hung our harps upon the willows in the midst of it. So we hung our harps. Apparently, the mourners had their harps with them as they sat on the ground and they mourned. And apparently, they played their harps when they sang their dirges. Apparently, because the captors asked them to play for their amusement. So the captors then are therefore hiding. They're actually hanging their harps on the weeping willows. So they had them with them. They're using them. And then their captors asked them to play something. And it says they hang them upon the willows. It could be poplar trees, could be either one. But they hang them. The poplars are tall, and they actually are all along the Euphrates River. So it could be poplars, but willows will translate it that way as well. But it says that they hung the harps upon the willows in the midst of it. And it's almost like the exiles are hiding their harps. Here they come, and we're gonna stop playing them now. We're gonna put them there because in verse 3, there those who carried us away captive asked of us a song, and those who plundered us requested mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. So they're singing these dirges. That's not hard to imagine. There's a lot of that in the Psalms, right? They're singing these dirges, and then these really cruel people say, sing us one of the songs. Well, it didn't take them long to start to hide their harps whenever they would show up. Sing us one of those, and they said they requested mirth. The word is actually simcha, so you might know the word simchat Torah, the rejoicing over the Torah, when the annual reading of the Torah ends and then restarts, the Parsha readings. And so that's actually called rejoicing over the Torah. That's the word there for simcha. So obviously what's happening here is the captors are maliciously requesting joyful songs. It's just malicious. Now, what are these songs of Zion? Okay, so Robert Alter says you shouldn't think of these songs as though they're in some category of some kind of special Yahweh song. For almost all the Psalms were in one way or another directed to the God of Israel. But I actually think he's missing it there. Because this phrase for songs of Zion, no other verse of the Bible contains it. So it seems to be a unique verse. In fact, no other verse contains these two words, even not in a phrase. They just don't have these two words together. So first of all, what is Zion? Zion is the place where sacrifices are offered. So this could suggest that what the captors are actually asking for are happy songs that would accompany sacrifices. And they actually could be mocking the God of Israel here. And the Jews essentially see a substantial living connection between any song that is associated with Zion. Why? Because Zion is the place where the sacrifices are offered. That's the place. And you can't have a sacrifice anyplace else. So they're going to see this connection. But then in the next verse, on the top of page 5, it doesn't use the exact same phrase, songs of Zion. It uses the phrase, the Lord's song, a little bit different. And this exact phrase is only used 2 other times in the Bible. And both of those times, it is used in the context of sacrifices that are being offered on Mount Zion. So it really looks to me like really what these captors are saying is, why don't you go ahead and sing us one of those songs that you would offer when you were offering your sacrifices? And now you can see the maliciousness that's coming out. Not only are they like being malicious towards the people, but it's like they're being malicious towards the God of the people. That's what it looks like to me. So where do we go from here then? We come into this second part of the psalm, which is the self-imprecation. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Now, this is not saying if I forget you like I don't have a memory of you. This is like saying instead, if I get lazy regarding the things, Lord, that you want from me, then, Lord, let this curse come upon me. That's what the psalmist is saying here. And he says, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. Let my right hand lose its ability. Why would he say that? Because the right hand is the hand that's used to pluck the instrument, and the tongue is used to sing the song. And Lord, if I forget you in this, they're asking me for a song. Would you break my tongue and my hand? He's just like calling this curse now down upon himself. He's committed. It's not far from the kind of picture, of course, in this case, this is a righteous person speaking. But you remember when Paul, right, in the book of Acts, right, doesn't it sound like that? And these Jews take the self-imprecation upon themselves. If anybody eats before we kill this guy. Okay, but here's the difference. Before we kill this guy, instead of kill me. There's a big difference there. So it's this self-imprecation. Now, Psalm 137:6 is really saying that Jerusalem gets first place when it comes to the things that should bring happiness to a Jew. That's really because this is the place. This is the place where this is Zion. If I forget you, Zion. And you might consider, when I thought about that, I'm thinking to myself, what about what God says to the church at Ephesus in Revelation? I have this against you. You've left your first love. Remember, therefore, where you've fallen. Repent and do the first works, or else I'll come to you quickly and remove your lampstand from its place unless you repent. So he does not say to the church at Ephesus, you don't love me. He says, I'm not your first love. That's different. You're talking about the land. About a week ago, I noticed in Genesis 12, you'll remember I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse, and you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That's verse 3. And in verse 7 and 8, right after that, it says that Abram was by the tree of Moreh, and he built an altar, and there he called upon the name of the Lord. I think that's verse 8, 7 or 8, where he calls upon the name of the Lord. It's actually the first time in the Bible where Abram calls upon the Lord. And it's interesting because he comes into the land, kind of like he comes into the land and becomes alive in a new way, kind of like Ezekiel. The Jews come into the land, and then the Spirit blows on them and they come alive. But what's interesting about the story with Abram is he builds an altar there, okay? But it doesn't mention any animal sacrifice. And that's really odd. Abram's not against sacrifices. He's going to offer his son. He's not against sacrifices, right? You mentioned the passage, and the reason that you read that passage at synagogue or open to it, that right after you came to the Lord, was because that passage is read in synagogues on Rosh Hashanah. Abram's not against sacrifices, but he doesn't offer a sacrifice. He just builds an altar, and he calls on the Lord. Why did he build the altar? There might be a little clue in the name of the tree, by the tree of Moreh, because the word Moreh means teacher. So it's like he builds this altar at this place, and he's essentially saying, God, would you show up and teach me? He's not building the altar for the purpose of offering a sacrifice. What caught me about it was what he's doing is he's building an altar, and this is how I shared it with Donna, for the purpose of stewarding his relationship with God. For the purpose of stewarding the presence of God in his life. Does that make sense? And I read that about a week ago, and I asked myself the question, how am I doing on stewarding the presence of God in my life? And what bothered me about that question, it's a lot like the story here in Revelation. I didn't get that because of this, but it's just coming together here in front of you. What got me about that was the thought that I did not like the fact that I could honestly think of times in my life when I think I did better at stewarding the presence of God in my life. And I think this passage in Revelation basically asks the same question. It doesn't ask if you love God. It asks, do you love him first? And I think the question that just begs to be asked with that is there ever been a time in your life when you loved God more? It really bothered me when I saw, has there ever been a time when I was stewarding the presence of God in my life better? Because I know there was. See the point there? If you get nothing else out of today, I hope you get that. How are you doing on stewarding the presence of God in your life? It matters. And why would this matter with regard to Jerusalem and the Jew? Because God has chosen Jerusalem as the place that the Jews were to bring their sacrifices, the place where they were to honor his name. In Revelation, in that passage with Ephesians, he actually says, remember where you have fallen from and redo what you've done in the past. Is there things that we used to do to steward the presence of God in our lives? Things that we used to do, because he says, God says, do it. Are there things that we used to do to demonstrate and to walk in love with God? Well, God chose for the Jew a special place that is connected, and it is Jerusalem. There's no other people group, as far as I know, in the history of the world. There's one book I have on the feasts that makes this point. There's no other people in the history of the world that will pray for rain in another country the way Jews pray for the rain in Jerusalem. God has chosen this place as a connecting point for the Jews. So for thousands of years, how does the Passover end? Next year in Jerusalem. That's how it ends. It's this connecting place. Okay, so when is the psalm used on page 6? Well, it's 3 things. On the 9th of Av, the day the temple was destroyed, it's read. It's read, part of it's read, I'll show in a moment, at weddings, and it's part of the grace after meals as well. So first of all, it's read annually on the day the temple was destroyed. I don't need to say any more about it than that. On the 9th of Av, which is, I wrote the date down so I could tell you, July 27th this year. So on that day, Jews all over the world will read this psalm. Then the psalm is used at Jewish weddings. Art Scroll says this: there is a custom for the bridegroom to recite this verse after the wedding canopy, or under the wedding canopy, as he awaits the arrival of his bride, to fulfill the Jew's eternal vow not to fail to elevate Jerusalem above his foremost joy. So verses 5 and 6 are read at weddings, so that on the day of his highest joy, the destruction of the temple is remembered. This says, the way Art Scroll says, to recite it under the canopy as he awaits. I've seen it that way, but I've also seen it, frankly, at the end of the wedding. And it's connected with the breaking of the glass. Right? So the point is, it's read at the wedding. Why is it read at the wedding? Well, I just thought I'd get a good quote on it, right? And so I just looked it up. And the first place I thought I'd go is something called My Jewish Learning. I tend to like that website. And they did not tell me what I thought I would see. Look what they actually said. The fragility of glass suggests that the frailty of human relationships. Since even the strongest love is subject to disintegration, the glass is broken as a kind of incantation. As this glass shatters, so may our marriage never break. Now, nobody would need to explain that logic to you and that symbolism. And in fact, I grew up thinking that was the case. because that's the obvious, kind of in your face. You break it at a wedding. It seems like a happy moment. You don't have to be paying real close attention to get the point, you know, right? But that is really not the history, despite the fact that it's my Jewish learning. It's really not the history. And the history, really, Chabad gives far more information about the history. And I'm going to read it to you just because, or at least a lot of it. The destruction of the Holy Temple has extreme personal relevance. It happened to you. It is true that the shattering the glass primarily commemorates the fall of Jerusalem. So why do we shatter the glass at a wedding? To remember the breaking of the temple. And we're putting that, we're not forgetting that at the moment of our highest joy, our wedding. However, it's also a reminder of another cataclysmic shattering, that of your very own temple, your soul. Flipping over, you can read the rest, most of it on your own later, page 7. The temple was not merely a building. It was the meeting place of heaven and earth. That's kind of obvious, right? His presence was there. The ideal and the real God and creation. When the temple was lost, so was the open relationship between God and the world. Our souls were ripped away from our soulmate. So your personal story and the story of Jerusalem's destruction are inextricably linked. The shattering that happened to Jerusalem happened to your soul. And when the temple is rebuilt, our souls will reunite with God, our soulmate, in a true relationship that we built together. We will no longer mourn the destruction, but looking back, we will finally understand its purpose, and we will celebrate, and then even the shattering will deserve the blessing of Mazel Tov. Now, probably everybody here has heard the phrase Mazel Tov, right? It's what you say like at a wedding. It's what you say if somebody has anything really good happen in their lives. Congratulations, you know, or good luck, happy for you. That's kind of like, that's the feeling of Mazel Tov. But I wanted to give you, like I did on the word imprecation earlier, and I put the little thing there, so it means curse. What does Mazel Tov really mean? Okay, here's another article by Chabad on the phrase Mazel Tov. I'm giving you, I think it's the first and last paragraph, or they're not consecutive. I thought it was interesting. The signs of the zodiac are called Mazalat. Jewish tradition sees the constellations on high as directing the destiny of individuals and nations down below. Thus, Mazel is the influence dripping down from the stars. Over the years, good or bad Mazel came to mean luck more than destiny. When the Talmud says that we're not subject to Mazel, it means that we're not limited to our destiny. Rather, our own actions determine our fate. When we tell someone Mazel Tov, we're giving them a blessing. May this drip of inspiration from your soul above not dissipate, but rather have a positive and lasting effect, that from this event onward, you should live your life with higher consciousness. You should be aware of the blessings in your life and be ready to receive more and more. Really, if we're going to be really honest, most of Judaism is, especially the more religious Jews, are enamored with essentially astrology. And it's all throughout the Talmud. And they'll say, well, it doesn't guide your life, but you better pay attention to it. Right? No, it's just all over the Talmud. And so, and obviously God warns Jewish people against it, but I don't have an excuse for it. I did a teaching in here a couple times a few years ago on astrology, and you can listen, and you can find it online too. Okay, so the Bible is also used, the Psalm rather, is also used before the grace after meals. And the way that Art Scroll says it is in order to keep the memory of the temple's destruction fresh in our minds, even when our bodies are filled with contentment. In other words, we just ate. Man, that was good. Let's read the Psalm. I'd rather just eat. Okay, then, so there's the first thing is this, the first part of the Psalm. What did I do here? The self was the the passion, and then the passionate pain, and then came the self-imprecation, and now comes this angry imprecation. And this is really where the psalm just becomes very challenging. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. This is not the day of Jerusalem like we have Jerusalem Day, Yom Yerushalayim, which is Jerusalem Day, when Eastern and Western Jerusalem were united in 1967 during the Six-Day War. This is not that Jerusalem Day. This is the Jerusalem Day when the Babylonians destroyed the temple. Okay? Remember, O Lord, the day of Jerusalem, when they said, raise it. And literally, the idea there is just tear it up and just tear down everything. I'm going over to page 8. And they're calling upon Edom. Now, this is a difficult passage. There's no way around. There's no way I can understate the significance of how difficult this passage is. Okay? But let me just kind of vomit it all on the table in front of you. Can I do that? Here we go. Okay. The curse is not just upon anybody. It's upon Edom. Esau was nicknamed Edom when he sold his father's blessing, that is, when he sold out his family for a bowl of red beans. And you can see the Old Testament says, Esau have I hated. And the New Testament says, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. So that's even New Testament now. This is not just Old Testament. This is New Testament. Edom sold out his family again at the Babylonian exile. And they actually even joined in at the destruction of the temple. You can read those other prophetic passages that I gave you in Amos and Jeremiah and Isaiah, but the one in Obadiah is just the clearest. The others are real clear too, but this is really clear. This is what Edom did, and the reason why Psalm 137 says, do this to them. Here we go. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. In other words, not have covenant. In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces. In other words, when they came in and took us all captive. When foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. Even you were as one of them. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother, because they are brothers. You remember, Jacob and Esau are brothers. In the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah. So they're partying over at this event. Okay, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of his distress. Ha! They deserve this. You should not have entered the gate of my people. So apparently, they didn't just stand out on the side; they actually entered into. Physically, walked into and participated. They weren't just joking and laughing from the other side. They were joking and laughing in the midst of the destruction, 1 million Jews being killed, just a mess. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance. So now they're actually also taking the stuff. And you should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among those who escaped. In other words, hey, they say, hey, Babylonians, there's some Jews there are escaping. Nor should you have delivered up those among those who remained. Hey, there's somebody here hiding in the basement. So this is the sin of Edom that the writer of the psalmist is calling out. In verse 8, he says, O daughter of Babylon, who are to be destroyed, happy the one who repays you as you have served us. Okay, so who are to be destroyed is a participle that's like a prophetic perfect. In other words, it literally means you are destroyed. In other words, it hasn't happened yet, but it's as though it has already happened, is the way this is being written. It's as sure as done. And then in verse 9, happy the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. This kind of atrocity is repeatedly recorded in the Bible to the Jews. It's done by Syria. It's done by the Assyrians. It's done by the Babylonians. And actually, when you look at it, it's very evident that verse 9 is a mirror of what apparently the Babylonians did to the Jews in verse 8, because of the way verse 8 ends. Happy the one who repays you as you have served us. So that's kind of the picture there. This was also done, by the way, to the Jews during World War II. You could read the book A Spy for God. Jewish children by their feet were swung to break their heads against rocks. Now that's the history, and this is some of the comment. Now Robert Alter, I mention him often in this class, and I really like the way he wrote this. No moral justification can be offered for this notorious concluding line. All one can do is recall the background of outraged feeling that triggers the conclusion. You can't defend it, he's saying. There's no defense. The Babylonians have laid waste to Jerusalem, exiled much of its population, looted and massacred the powerless captives, ordered, perhaps mockingly, to sing their Zion songs, respond instead with a lament that is not really a song and ends with this blood-curdling curse pronounced on their captors, who fortunately do not understand the Hebrew in which it is pronounced. In other words, he's saying, at least they don't even know what's being said, because there's no way to defend this line, is what he's saying. Sansino says this barbarity was often perpetrated against Israel, he gives a bunch of verses, and the Babylonians were guilty of it. The Cultural Background Study Bible has an interesting quote, and it's just, it's all, like I said, I'll vomit on the table in front of you. The dark realities of warfare in the ancient Near East often doomed the innocent to destruction, while soldiers and men were often subject to dismemberment and impalement. Women and children might also be ravished and slaughtered. You can see it in Hosea 10. Pregnant women might be literally cut open in order to pull the babies out of their wombs. And infants were smashed on the ground. All to eliminate not only the current generation, but the next one. That's... Sansino quotes the Expositor's Bible, so I went and got a little bit larger quote, the Expositor's Bible. Perhaps if some of their modern critics had been under the yoke from which the psalmist had been delivered, they would have understood a little better how a good man of that age could rejoice that Babylon was fallen and all its race extirpated. Perhaps it would do modern tenderheartedness no harm to have a little more iron infused into its gentleness than to lay to heart that the King of peace must first be the King of righteousness, and that destruction of evil is the complement of the preservation of good. Page 10, I think, is really the help for the psalm, if I could say it that way. How should we respond to verses like verse 9? First of all, it's a challenge. And I think Kidner gave the best I could find on this. He says, and these are quotes from him, first, to distill the essence of it, as God himself did with the cries of Job and Jeremiah. Now, I'll be frank, I don't know what to do with that line. I don't know, what does that mean, to distill the essence of it? How do I practically do that? Right? I mean, how do I implement that? So for me, that means nothing. I can't get anything out of that. Secondly, to receive the impact of it. This raw wound thrust before us forbids us to give smooth answers to the fact of cruelty. To cut this witness out of the Old Testament would be to impair its value as revelation, both of what is in man and of what the cross required to achieve our salvation. In other words, what he's saying here is the second thought underscores the necessity of the cross. Completely, yes. Underscores the necessity of the cross. Absolutely. Okay? Third point he makes. Our response should be to recognize that our calling since the cross is to pray down reconciliation and not judgment. Now, Kidner's third point is absolutely true. However, he is absolutely wrong to think that it is any different in the New Testament from the Old Testament. He's wrong-headed. He couldn't be more wrong. Notice the words of Yeshua before the ratification of the new covenant. In Luke chapter 9, when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them and said to them, "You do not know what kind of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And they went on to another village. Now, a wrong-headed person, I can't say anything other than ignorance. It would take ignorance to say that, oh, okay, that's New Testament, and that's what, no, that's Old Testament, because Yeshua has not yet ratified the New Testament. He has not established the new covenant. This is an Old Testament setting, and he expects Old Testament saints to be able to walk in this kind of grace towards people. There's no difference between the new and the old with regard to what God expects out of the human and how we treat one another. That's not different. It is true this happened all over the place in the Old Testament days. That's true. It's true it happened to Israel a lot, but it's just not true that it's different, as it were, in the Gospels, because that's New Testament. No, the Gospels are Old Testament until Jesus dies and rises from the dead. Because without the shedding of blood, there is no covenant. See the point? So he's wrong on that, but he is right that our response should be, in this third point, to recognize our calling since the cross, certainly, but before the cross, to recognize the calling of any person is to pray down reconciliation and not judgment. And that's why people like Robert Alter can say, who is not a believer in Jesus, there's no way to defend this. He's not speaking as though as though the New Testament were an issue. He says there's just no way to defend this, right? Because it's inhumane. Okay, does that make sense? So Yeshua expected Old Testament saints to live above that attitude. So why would God put such a mean-spirited verse in Psalm 137:9? If you ask the wrong question, you're going to get the wrong answer every time. Perhaps it's not meanness. Perhaps that's really the wrong question. Perhaps what we have here is an honest, expressed pain. Perhaps the psalmist is essentially crying out in verse 9, "How would you like this to happen to your children, Babylonians?" Perhaps the point of the verse is to call people to recognize their pain and to process it. And that process is still required of saints who are already in heaven. They're already there in Revelation 6. And and they're dealing with it. So it's not Old Testament, New Testament, it's not earth, it's not heaven. This is reality. And people just have to learn how to deal with it. But the idea that someone would do this under any circumstances is just inexcusable. Does that make sense? What gets me is, why would God put this in his eternal book of worship? The top 150 worship songs of the Bible. That's a hard one, isn't it? Because that's what the Psalms are. They're the top 150. And God puts this in there. And maybe it'll be just to remind us in his eternal word, look what he has delivered us from. Praise the Lord.